Listen carefully, because the next 8 seconds are the last moments of your old life. Imagine a house where 12 children sleep under one roof, and every night, something in the walls breathes that isn't human. A whisper no one admits hearing. A pressure no one can name. A presence that waits not for one child, but for 6. And decades later, when doctors, historians, and institutions finally dared to open the records, they didn't find answers. They found a pattern, a design, a controlled collapse disguised as chance. You're about to hear the story of the Galvin family, yes, the one the textbooks sensationalize as genetic tragedy. But what you won't hear in any documentary is the part that matters most. What happens when a family becomes a test site and nobody notices until the damage is irreversible? Lean in, 'cause I'm not here to give you a ghost story. I'm here to reveal the mechanisms behind it, the systems that exploit the weak, the obedient, the picture-perfect American family that never saw the trap until the jaws were already locked. Hidden Valley Road. A normal street, a normal house, a family so large the neighbors joked they were building their own hometown. But beneath the smiling church photos and military-grade discipline was a pressure cooker engineered by 2 forces no child can escape: secrecy and expectation. The father, a decorated Air Force officer. The mother, obsessed with perfection so violently precise she recorded her children's lives with the cold documentation of a surveillance file. And that's where our story truly begins, not with madness, but with control. Because before 6 brothers fell into the kind of darkness that modern medicine still stares at in confusion, they were shaped, sculpted, conditioned. Every day of their childhood was a rehearsal for a role they couldn't understand: the perfect American sons. And a truth most men never realize is this: when you bend a child's identity far enough, something inside them snaps, and what comes out is not madness, but escape. A break from a system they didn't choose. This is the part nobody ever says out loud. The Galvin tragedy wasn't just biological. It was environmental, structural, institutional. A storm formed from pressure no human being, let alone 12 children, should ever be forced to withstand. And we're only at the outer door. What waits deeper inside this story changes you once you hear it. Every descent has a threshold, an invisible line you cross without realizing it. For the Galvin family, that line appeared the moment their eldest son, Donald Jr., stepped out of the controlled world his parents built and into the chaos of real life. And the truth is this: when a man raised under rigidity confronts freedom for the first time, he doesn't expand. He fractures. College should have been liberation. For Donald, it became exposure. The walls that once contained him were gone, and the mind that had been conditioned for obedience suddenly had to navigate complexity, choice, ambiguity. That's when the cracks began to appear. Not in random chaos, but in a pattern like the unraveling of a tightly wound wire finally snapping loose. He stopped sleeping. He muttered to himself about coded messages in textbooks. He believed professors were evaluating him for a government program. And that might sound like delusion until you understand the psychological truth beneath it. When a man is raised inside a command structure, paranoia is not insanity. It's expectation without guidance. It's the mind trying to map a world it was never taught to navigate. But institutional America doesn't allow its shining families to fail publicly. When Donald Jr. ran into the bonfire and came out whispering about purification rituals and messages from flames, it should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it was buried, quieted, erased from the record by a father with military connections and a mother who believed reputation was more real than her son's suffering. That silence, that was the real infection. Because secrets inside a family act like mold. They spread, they multiply, and they feed on the youngest first. Donald was brought back home, but he didn't return. The man who stepped into Hidden Valley Road was someone else, haunted, fragmented, staring at the sky like it was speaking directly to him. And the worst part? His parents treated it not as a warning, but as an inconvenience, a flaw to be hidden, a wrinkle in the portrait they were trying so desperately to maintain. But his siblings noticed. They saw their hero deteriorating. They watched the strongest among them become a vessel for something none of them understood. And young minds, especially in a house built on silence, internalize what they see. They learned that madness wasn't a medical condition. It was a destiny. And destiny, once it enters a family, does not stop with the first child. You need to understand something crucial before we continue. In a family like the Galvins, the first collapse is never the last. Once one pillar fractures, the entire structure begins to lean. The foundation shifts, the house groans, and the pressure that once shaped the children into model citizens now begins reshaping them into something else entirely. Because when Donald Jr. returned home, he didn't come back alone. He brought with him an atmosphere, an invisible gravitational field of dread and unpredictability. His siblings learned to listen for the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, to read the slightest change in his breathing, to brace for what version of him would emerge from the shadows that day. The charming brother they loved, or the hollow-eyed specter muttering codes only he could decipher. But the most dangerous part wasn't his instability. It was the way their mother, Mimi, insisted everything was normal. She doubled down on control, on presentation, on the illusion of perfection. Every morning she polished the facade like an artifact in a museum, refusing to acknowledge the cracks spreading beneath it. And when a parent denies a child's reality, the child begins to doubt his own. This is the psychological chokehold nobody talks about. Denial is a form of indoctrination. It rewrites your internal compass. It forces you to navigate a maze without trusting your own senses. Under that pressure, the younger brothers learned to silence their instincts, to swallow their fear, to perform stability. But suppression doesn't erase trauma, it ferments it. And in a home already primed with genetic vulnerability, that fermentation becomes explosive. One by one, subtle shifts began. John withdrawing from friends. Brian erupting into sudden, inexplicable rage. Michael, the quiet one, scribbling violent drawings that no adult bothered to examine. These weren't isolated incidents, they were alarm bells. Signals the system ignored. Because when a family is obsessed with being perfect, it becomes blind to its own doom. And something else was happening beneath the surface too, something far more insidious. The siblings started to believe that what was happening to Donald might one day happen to them. They were living inside a prophecy, a self-fulfilling one. The idea that madness was not an event, but an inheritance. And what a child believes he is destined to become, he eventually does. Before we descend further, I want you to anchor yourself in this moment. Because halfway through this video, I need you to comment a symbolic phrase to lock in your transformation. I see the pattern. I break the pattern. Write it twice. By the time the younger brothers felt the tremors of their own unraveling, the Galvin household was no longer a home, it was a pressure chamber. And pressure, when left unacknowledged, becomes prophecy. It shapes a man's mind long before he realizes the shaping has begun. You have to remember, these boys weren't just living with a mentally collapsing brother. They were living inside a system designed to deny reality at all costs. And when reality is forbidden, the mind begins to create its own. The second brother to fall showed signs so subtle that even today, researchers argue over when the descent truly started. Was it the sudden isolation? The quiet muttering behind closed doors? The night he locked himself in the bathroom because he believed someone or something was waiting outside? No one knows. And that uncertainty is the most disturbing truth of all. Madness, in this family, didn't announce itself. It seeped. Imagine being a young man in that environment, feeling your thoughts weaken like frayed cables, knowing exactly where those cables lead because you've watched your older brother dissolve right in front of you. The question wasn't if, it was when. And through it all, Mimi continued her crusade for normalcy. The Galvins still attended church in matching outfits. They still smiled for photos. They still performed the ritual of American perfection. But rituals become cages when they deny the truth inside them. Every forced smile drove the boys deeper into internal exile. Every polished surface in that immaculate home reflected back a lie they were required to live. And here is the part most men miss when they study this story. Silence is not neutral. Silence is corrosive. It dissolves the boundaries between fear and identity. It teaches young men to distrust themselves, to question their instincts, to treat their own pain as defiance. In that environment, the second brother's breakdown triggered the third. The third triggered the fourth. The fourth triggered the fifth. Madness became a chain reaction, each collapse adding weight to the next. In a family of 12 children, 6 sons fell into the same abyss, statistically impossible, yet psychologically inevitable. Because the human mind, when trapped between genetic fragility and environmental oppression, doesn't simply break, it mirrors. This is the moment where the story stops being a family tragedy and becomes something larger. A case study in how institutions, expectations, and secrecy can sculpt catastrophe. The Galvin brothers weren't simply sick. They were shaped by forces that never intended to be seen. If the first half of this story showed you the symptoms, now we step into the machinery, the hidden framework that turned the Galvin family into a living laboratory. And make no mistake, once you understand this part, you'll never again look at tragedy as something accidental. Because behind every collapse that looks personal, there is a system that made it possible. You see, when the Galvin brothers began falling one by one, the institutions surrounding them didn't sound alarms, they sharpened scalpels. Researchers, academics, and psychiatric pioneers circled Hidden Valley Road like vultures wearing white coats. They called it opportunity. They called it a once-in-a-generation case. They collected data, samples, interviews, but what they never collected was responsibility. The brothers weren't treated. They were studied. To the outside world, the family became a goldmine of genetic insight. But to the brothers, it felt like classification being sorted into categories they never chose. Mel, pre-mel, genetic anomaly, living specimen, and the most brutal label of all, inevitable. Imagine being 20 years old and hearing from a doctor that your fate may already be written, that your thoughts might betray you, that your identity could dissolve without warning. For a young man, that isn't medicine. It's sorcery. It rewrites your future before you can live it. And while the institutions poked and prodded the brothers, no one examined the environment that had sculpted them. No one studied the suffocating discipline of their father. No one questioned the mother's militant perfectionism. No one looked at the emotional starvation, the rigid silence, the pressure cooker expectations that could have snapped the mind of any son, genetic vulnerability or not. Because institutions prefer simple stories. Gene equals illness. Family equals case study. Collapse equals data point. But the truth is rarely simple and never clean. The Galvin brothers became 6 mirrors reflecting one central question. Does madness arise from biology or from the systems shaping biology? And the answer, though institutions avoid saying it, lies in the fusion of both. A volatile mixture, perfect storm waiting to ignite. The doctors kept digging for chromosomes. They analyzed DNA like it held all the secrets. But what they missed was the deeper layer, the invisible architecture of emotional conditioning, familial hierarchy, silence, denial, and the crushing weight of impossible expectations. This story is not just about the failure of a family. It's about the failure of a system that created them, then pretended it didn't. There comes a moment in every descent where the line between victim and participant blurs, where the system shaping you becomes the system you unknowingly reinforce. For the Galvin brothers, that moment arrived when the family's darkness shifted from internal collapse to violent consequence. By the late 1970s, the house on Hidden Valley Road was no longer a pressure chamber, it was a battlefield. The brothers, who still hovered between reality and delusion, began acting out the nightmares forming in their minds. And violence, once unthinkable, became inevitable. Not because they were evil, but because they were drowning, and drowning men do not swim gracefully. They thrash. The first major break came when one brother, deep in a paranoid spiral, became convinced he was receiving commands coded, divine, unavoidable. In his warped logic, those commands demanded action. And when he turned that belief toward a family member, the entire facade finally ruptured. Suddenly, the Galvin tragedy wasn't a hidden burden, it was blood on the floor, police at the door, and institutions scrambling to contain something they never truly understood. And here is the part nobody likes to acknowledge. Violence in madness is rarely spontaneous. It is the final expression of unaddressed pain. a mind left unmanaged for too long, a soul pushed beyond its threshold. But instead of reevaluating their approach, the institutions doubled down. More diagnoses, more experiments, more labels, more files, more theories, and still no one asked the foundational question: how much of this violence was the illness, and how much was the environment that fed it? Because chaos doesn't grow in a vacuum. It grows in silence. It grows in repression. It grows in cultures where men are raised to withstand everything but allowed to express nothing. By the time the fourth brother spiraled into full psychosis, the Galvin home was a ghost ship, its halls echoing with the weight of unspoken terror. The youngest boys watched their older brothers disappear into institutions one by one, and in their hearts, a new emotion took root: expectation. They didn't fear becoming their brothers. They anticipated it. That's the real horror of this story, not the madness itself, but the quiet acceptance of it as destiny. And destiny, when believed deeply enough, becomes self-executing. The Galvin family had not merely inherited illness. They had inherited inevitability. There is a point in every tragedy where the descent stops feeling like a series of events and starts feeling like a verdict. For the Galvin family, that moment came when the brothers' unraveling reached its peak, not with another diagnosis, not with another hospitalization, but with the shattering realization that the family's timeline itself had split. Before this point, there was still the illusion of control. After it, only aftermath. One brother, already deep in psychosis, succumbed to an internal war no one could see. Another followed soon after, different in circumstance but identical in outcome. Two sons gone forever, one by violence toward himself, the other swallowed by despair so complete it silenced him permanently. And when a family loses children this way, the loss doesn't remain in the room where it happened. It radiates. It stains the walls, the memories, the very narrative of the home. The remaining siblings, those still clinging to the world by their fingernails, felt the rupture like a gravitational shift. A death inside a family like this is not just an ending. It is a signal, a warning, a declaration that the forces consuming them were no longer content to remain psychological. They had crossed into the physical, the irreversible. And here's the fracture no one outside that house could understand. Their grief was not clean. It was tangled with fear, with guilt, with the quiet terror that they might be next. Because every time a brother slipped beyond the reach of help, the others felt the pull. The sense of inevitability tightening around them like a rope. The idea that whatever force haunted their family genes, trauma, pressure, silence was claiming them in sequence, one by one, like the ticking of a ritual clock. The parents, shattered and aging, still clung to the illusion that order could be restored. But order is fragile. Order is man-made. And what had overtaken their family was far beyond any structure they had built. The facade collapsed, the perfection died, and all that remained was the raw truth they had run from for decades. Denial doesn't protect a family, it damns it. This was the moment the Galvin story transformed from tragedy into legacy, from pain into pattern, from isolated crisis into a generational echo that the surviving siblings would carry into adulthood, relationships, parenthood, identity. Some escaped, some didn't, but none left untouched. If you've followed this descent all the way here, then you're no longer just listening to the story of the Galvin family. You're standing inside its blueprint. Because the final truth isn't about their collapse at all. It's about what collapses mean in families, in institutions, and inside the mind of any man who's been shaped by forces he was never allowed to question. By the end of the Galvin saga, 6 sons had been claimed by madness, 2 lost forever. The rest scattered like debris from an explosion no one could locate the detonation point of. But the real epicenter was silence. A silence enforced by a culture that worshipped perfection. A military father who confused discipline with emotional distance. A mother who built a kingdom of appearances even as the walls trembled. And systems that prized data over human survival. And that's where this story transcends its setting. Because the truth is every man carries environments within him. Some inherited, some imposed, some chosen. But when those environments start shaping your identity without your awareness, you become like the Galvin sons. a passenger in your own mind, acting out a script you didn't write. That's why this story strikes so deeply. It mirrors the darker architecture of the world you live in. You've been told to be strong but not vulnerable, disciplined but not expressive, capable but not questioning, a man who absorbs everything but shares nothing. And that right there is the psychological trap that destroyed the Galvin family long before their genetics played a role. The world praises men for carrying weight, then pretends not to notice when that weight crushes them. But you're here now, and that means something, because by witnessing this descent, you've stepped outside the illusion. You've seen how environments shape identity, how silence mutates into suffering, how denial becomes destiny. And once you see the pattern, you're no longer bound by it. So this is where your transformation begins, not in their tragedy, but in your awareness. Remember what I asked you earlier. This is the moment it matters most. Comment the phrase twice below, not as engagement, but as initiation. I see the pattern. I break the pattern. I see the pattern. I break the pattern. Type it. Seal it. Because men who recognize the architecture of control are the ones who dismantle it. And as you rise from this descent, understand this final truth. Dangerous knowledge doesn't destroy you, frees you. If you've reached this far into the descent, then you're exactly the kind of seeker this channel was built for. Hit the subscribe button, activate the bell, and step with me into the next forgotten chapter. The deeper we go, the more the past starts to whisper back.